Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Last year, the press was bragging about how they were shutting down coal-fired power plants in America and Europe. And The Guardian asked, what happens when America's coal plants die? The answer to that question was always quite obvious. When you reduce the supply of an essential commodity which you're relying on, you're not going to have enough of that commodity. And now Bloomberg reports that we don't have enough electricity. But they don't blame the shortage of electricity on government shutting down the supply. Instead, they blame it on climate change, the pandemic, and war.
Why is the world facing its worst power crisis in decades this summer? Parts of South Asia, home to 1 billion people, are already facing daily power outages lasting hours.
Grids across the U.S. are warning of blackouts this summer, and Europe's power situation rests uneasily under the sword of Damocles that is Russia's threat to cut off gas supply to the continent.
So why is power supply suddenly in such a crisis? The reasons come back to 3 things: climate change, the pandemic, and war.
The change in climate is increasing the frequency of extreme weather events, like heat waves that are scorching India and Pakistan and driving up power demand for air conditioners, as well as droughts that are leaving reservoirs depleted in places dependent on hydropower, like California. The rebound from the pandemic has also driven increased power use after 2 years of lockdowns, resulting in a rise in fuel prices that began late last year. Russia's invasion of Ukraine supercharged that energy inflation. Coal is trading at record levels right now. European gas is triple its level from a year ago, and oil is back to $100 a barrel. That's made it difficult for poor countries like Sri Lanka and Myanmar to import fuel needed to keep the lights on. Even in richer nations that can't afford to pay, it's hurting consumers.
But it doesn't stop there. This summer may just be a preview of things to come.
Net zero goals and expensive fuel are spurring countries to build more cheap solar and wind power, which is certainly a shift necessary to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But investments have lagged in power grids and energy storage needed to translate intermittent energy into around-the-clock electricity.
So until that kind of infrastructure catches up, just flipping on the light switch may become something the world has to stop taking for granted.
Governments created the shortage in the name of climate change, and now they're blaming the shortage of energy on climate change, COVID, and Putin. The reality is that Earth's temperature today is only 0.1 degrees above the 1979 to 2000 average. This has been fairly typical for the year 2022. So the shortage of electricity is not being driven by extreme temperatures. Instead, it's being driven by extreme government policies. Bloomberg says a hot, deadly summer is coming with frequent blackouts from the USA to Asia. But reality is that in the United States, for the past 9 summers, the frequency of hot days has been close to a record low. Nighttime temperatures in the United States so far this year have been 6th coldest on record. The frequency of cold nights in the United States so far this year has been 2nd highest on record after 1895. And the frequency of warm afternoons in the United States so far this year have been close to a record low. Climate change, the pandemic, and war are not the causes of the energy shortages. Fuel prices started skyrocketing immediately after the 2020 election in anticipation of Biden energy policies. This isn't building back better. Instead, it's tearing everything down. I took this picture in northern Colorado on Valentine's Day 2021. Temperatures were record cold, there was no wind, and the solar panels were all covered with snow. The wind turbines over the hill in Wyoming were shut down due to icing and a lack of wind. The Colorado grid came close to collapsing like what happened in Texas that day, but was held together by a few coal-fired power plants like this one. But the governor of Colorado is planning on shutting down this coal-fired power plants in the next few years. Without this coal-fired power plants, a lot of people in northern Colorado would have died on February 14th, 2021. But the Colorado governor is planning on shutting the power plant down. So what is his agenda? Let's watch the last few seconds of the Bloomberg video again.
This summer may just be a preview of things to come.
Net zero goals and expensive fuel are spurring countries to build more cheap solar and wind power, which is certainly a shift necessary to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But investments have lagged in power grids and energy storage needed to translate intermittent energy into around-the-clock electricity.
So until that kind of infrastructure catches up, just flipping on the light switch may become something the world has to stop taking for granted.
Bloomberg is admitting that we don't have the technology necessary to replace the coal-fired power plants. And they're saying that the solution is that the little people are just going to have to live without electricity. A shortage of energy will lead to poverty and hunger on a massive scale around the world, and this seems to be the decision which governments are making. Bloomberg says that governments don't have any choice. They have to make this change to avoid climate change. There's no truth to that, but it's how tyrants have always operated. William Pitt said, "Necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It's the argument of tyrants, it's the creed of slaves." Toto is having a difficult time believing that these insane government policies are being driven by ignorance, which leaves the other possibility that policy is being driven by malice. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.